name's Stephen Latter, and my presentation is going to be in the UK continental shelf fiscal regime, a history of the fiscal regime of the UK continental shelf. I will touch on some analysis, but fundamentally it's going to be a talk through the past 40 years, taxation of the UK continental shelf. Now, to understand the background to this topic, we have to go way back to the late 1960s. In the Labour government of the time, their initial instinct was to have the North Sea under state control. They were heavily influenced at the time by the socialist Scandinavian model, and this is the way they wanted to. This is the way that they wanted to control the UK continental shelf. However, by the mid 1970s, there had been an acceptance that private enterprise would continue to play the key part in the recovery of reserves in the North Sea, and that the state's share, if you like, would be taken through the taxation regime. Now, the first proposal for an actual taxation in North Sea was put forward in 1974, and it took effect in 1975. It took effect in the Oil Taxation Act of 1975. There were two principal objectives to this legislation. Firstly, to secure a fairer share of profits for the nation from the recovery of the reserves, and to assert greater public control as well. And there were three key components as well to the Oil Taxation Act: royalty, petroleum revenue tax, and corporation tax. Royalty, this is just a payment to the landowner or to the Crown in this case for the right to extract oil and gas. And under the 1975 Act, this was fixed at 12.5%, 12.5% gross revenues, with a deduction for treating and conveying costs. Petroleum revenue tax, an entirely new type of tax, as its name suggests, a new type of tax at the time. This was assessed on a field basis. So the fields were, if you like, ring-fenced in terms of taxation. A company with losses in one field could not offset those losses against another profitable field. Petroleum revenue tax, or PRT, was set at 45% on the value of oil and gas produced, and this broadly equated to receipts less expenditure incurred in developing and operating the field. So PRT was set at 45%. The rationale behind this tax, the PRT, was to capture the economic rent from the more profitable fields. Less profitable projects were protected to some extent, however, as a consequence of the various allowances and reliefs that were put in place alongside the PRT. The three key reliefs were uplift. What this uplift was an additional allowance of 75% to capital expenditure, CapEx, in order that companies did not start paying petroleum revenue tax until they had at least recovered 175% of their capital expenditure. Oil allowance, this allowed 1 million tonnes of oil per annum to be exempt from petroleum revenue tax up to a cumulative maximum of 10 million tonnes. As a consequence, PRT is unlikely to be, or was unlikely to be payable on fields with reserves of less than 100 million barrels. And the rationale here was to help the development of marginal fields. Safeguard was the third allowance or relief, and this limited the petroleum revenue tax liability in any chargeable period to 80% of the amount by which cumulative gross profit exceeded 15% of cumulative expenditure. And this was introduced to ensure that while it applies, PRT, calculated after taking account of all other reliefs, does not reduce the participator's return on capital in any chargeable period to 15% or less. So it does not reduce the organisation's return on capital to 15% or less. Corporation tax was set at 52% on company profits. corporation tax is the same, in effect, the same corporation tax that was applicable to any organisation that was liable to corporation tax, and exploration costs were deductible against this, and the distinction here with corporation tax with organisations and other industries was it was a ring-fenced element to UK continental shelf exploration and production activity. The system was tightened up in 1878 to 1982, with oil prices increasing. Petroleum revenue tax was increased to 60%. The uplift allowance was lowered from 75% or 175% of capex down to 35%, and the oil allowance was changed from 1 million tonne to 500,000 tonnes per year, and the maximum allowance went down from 10 million tonnes to just 5 million tonnes. In 1980, petroleum revenue tax was raised to 70%, increasing the combined marginal rate of tax to 87%. The marginal rate of tax was 87% in the early 80s in the UKCS. And this also, 87%, also incorporated the introduction of a new tax, supplementary petroleum duty, which was introduced at this time. Like royalty, supplementary petroleum duty was charged on a field-by-field basis by reference to the way SPD, or supplementary petroleum duty, worked was 20% gross revenues less an oil allowance of 1 million tonnes per annum. And SPD was applied in the early production life of the field, and it was paid on a monthly basis. However, in 1981-82, there was a reduction in both oil prices and the declining levels of development activity, and this combined with continuing industry pressure on the government led the government to make some relaxations to support and encourage exploration and appraisal activity, particularly in new fields in the North Sea. So supplementary petroleum duty was abolished, and this was replaced by Advanced Petroleum Revenue Tax, APRT. Now, like the supplementary petroleum duty that it replaced, this was imposed on gross revenues less an allowance of 1 metric tonne per year, and the rate was 20%. But it wasn't a new tax. APRT wasn't a new tax. It was just an instrument for accelerating the payment of petroleum revenue tax. Petroleum revenue tax was increased to 75%. Royalties in any new fields receiving development consent after April 82 were also abolished. An oil allowance against petroleum revenue tax restored top 1 million tonnes per year for a maximum of 10 years, so it was restored to the previous levels. And cross-field allowance was introduced for the petroleum revenue tax, and hopefully cross-field allowance is self-explanatory. So a lot of concessions made there to encourage more development, more activity, certainly in the new fields. In 1986, APRT was abolished, and corporation tax that applied on oil activity was reduced to 35%. And in 1993, the Chancellor announced in his budget speech, which led to new changes in the fiscal regime again. The Chancellor was quoted in saying, "The marginal tax rate at 83%, so very high but lower than what it was, is little incentive to keep costs under control or for additional investment in existing fields. Consequently, petroleum revenue tax was reduced to 50% on existing fields receiving approval before April 1993, and abolished in all fields receiving consent after that date." So further incentives for organisations to operate, further fiscal incentives. 2002 was the next change, when there was the imposition of a supplementary charge. Oil prices were rising in the late 1990s, and there were two fiscal reforms proposed: the application of a supplementary corporation tax on upstream activities profits, and the reintroduction of PRT in fields receiving consent after March 1993. These were proposed, but after a sharp fall in oil prices in 1998, they were both dropped. However, in 2002, reforms were introduced, which were similar to these ones that were proposed in 1998. The supplementary charge, which equated to 10% in profits, subject to corporation tax, was applied in addition to the normal 30% rate as a 30% rate of corporation tax as a revenue-raising measure, and 100% capital investment allowance against both general corporation tax and the supplementary charge, instead of the 25% allowance per annum declining balance was previously available. The supplementary charge was increased in 2005. It was doubled to 20%, and it was subsequently increased again to 32% in 2011. These most recent of changes, or certainly the most recent one in 2011, is all about getting a greater return to the exchequer, and we're probably now back in a position where there are going to have to be some concessions to encourage more activity in the North Sea. Having said that, oil prices are still high, and we'll have to wait and see what happens in terms of the fiscal regime in the UK continental shelf. I think taxation in the North Sea has been characterised by the UK government constantly tinkering with it, and there doesn't seem to be any change to that perspective in any time soon. Thank you.